So we wish to on which the University of St. Michael's College operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I wanted to just quickly introduce the University of St. Michael's College Continuing Education Division. I will not spend too long talking about this because we want to give our panelists the full span of the time available to them. But I do want to just highlight that this presentation today is part of our Continuing Education Division and is presented by us. The Continuing Education Division at St. Mike's has a lot of ways to get involved. So there are longer professional programs like our social impact measurement, social responsibility and sustainability, and interfaith dialogue diplomas. There is a diploma in Catholic leadership that's starting this year as well. There are creative courses in things like writing, language, film, food, all sorts of things to explore to feed your curiosity and passion as a lifelong learner. And there are also courses in teacher education. We're an accredited partner to offer additional qualification courses and offer a number of these courses specifically for teaching in Catholic schools, which is really exciting. Without any further ado, I'm glad to welcome everybody to Hope in Action Leading Through Chaos, presented by Dr. Golnaz Golnaraghi in conversation with Dr. Shilpa Tiwari. Our speakers today are Dr. Golnaz Golnaraghi. She is the president and founder of Accelerate Her Future. Dr. Golnaraghi is a leadership and gender equity scholar, educator, and social impact entrepreneur whose work focuses on EDI and gender equity in organizations and the human and social dimensions of responsible leadership. With more than 3 decades of experience spanning corporate, higher education, and social innovation, she examines how organizations can design systems of work that advance equity, dignity, and opportunity. Dr. Shilpa Tiwari is a sustainability and social impact executive with over 15 years of experience. She is the program director for the Diploma in Social Responsibility and Sustainability at Continuing Education here, and she has had a long career in this field. Just to recap, for anyone who wasn't here at the very beginning, you can participate at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A box. You can ask questions anytime. This conversation is really going to be quite fluid. There's not going to be, like, this is the last slide you will see today. There's not a big presentation. So we hope that you'll be able to jump in as you're moved to ask questions, and I will make sure that they get to Shilpa and Golnaz. And if you inadvertently lose connection, you can rejoin anytime using the same link. I will now turn off myself and hand things over.
Thank you so much, Roxanne, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. I am thrilled to be here today to speak to my dear friend, colleague, Golnaz Golnaraghi. So Golnaz, let's get into this conversation that we have been chatting about for a while now. As you know, and as I assume everyone also in the audience knows, we are living through a period of institutional strain, polarization, and a lot of deep fatigue. From your perspective, what makes leading change today different than leading change 5 years ago or even 10 years ago?
Thanks so much, Shilpa, and I want to thank everyone for being here. I see some familiar faces and even some past students of mine in the audience, which is wonderful. What feels different right now is, and before I jump in, I'm giving one perspective. Shilpa, I'd love to hear your perspective as well. And from the audience, please share your experiences in the chat. We want to engage with you. So what feels different in my mind right now is that strain is happening everywhere. And sometimes it feels like it's happening at once, overlapping in institutions, in our teams and people. And to your point, 5, 10, 20 years ago, change often happened within. Now that I really look back and I thought change was happening back then, it was relatively stable compared to now, right? Like, so today, leaders, we are all navigating overlapping pressures, as you've noted, economic uncertainty, geopolitical instability, global tensions, supply chain disruptions, social polarization, AI. I think there was a session on AI last month. So there's a lot happening. And of course, rising expectations around equity and accountability, which are themes that come up in my work a lot. So change is no longer kind of a contained thing. It's continuous, it's visible, it can be emotionally charged. And what that means is that leaders are no longer operating from a predictable system.
Mhm.
It's sort of, they're made up of, it's made up of many interconnected parts. And when something shifts in one area, it can affect everything else. And people and teams are constantly adapting to what's happening around them, it feels like. And
Mhm.
so we know that organizations are not like machines, right? Especially when we think about the industrial kind of age, it's more like living systems, interconnected, nonlinear, constantly evolving, and very emergent. And what happens is when one part of the system is impacted, it shows up elsewhere as well. So step by step linear frameworks or approaches just in my mind don't make sense in these conditions. So the shift for me is really this is less about managing change, which is often the phrase that we hear a lot about, but maybe more about navigating complexity, and that asks something very different of leaders. And maybe it asks in my leadership programs, we often talk about awareness, sensing your environment, paying attention to what's actually happening in the system, and rather than trying to control every single step.
Thanks, Golnaz. It's just in terms of like from my perspective, what I've seen in organizations too over the last few years, we have a really diverse workforce too, in like
Oh, yeah.
highly intergenerational, right? Which takes a whole different level of intelligence in terms of how do you weave all these different generations in terms of their skill set and knowledge. And I find that we also in organizations need to work more at a systems level, and we're not trained to do that, right? As you know, I focus on sustainability, and I find that the work I do touches every aspect of an organization. So I have
Yes.
to work cross-functionally, but we have been trained from from a very young age to really think in silos, and it's interesting because I think our future, particularly around organizations and institutional development, is really building that ability to genuinely collaborate and understand our issues and our world from a systems point of view, which it'll be interesting to see how we move in that direction. Because everything around us is not necessarily enabling that way of thinking, right? So,
So it's that systems thinking that becomes really important. I'll
mhm,
add one more. Another piece that comes up a lot in my world is the need to upskill, reskill the workforce to meet the need of change. And how do we do that at scale?
mhm,
That keeps coming up. But I would also add, if we don't address issues like systems level issues around equity,
mhm.
even within that conversation, we're still perpetuating some of the same imbalances that we're seeing in workplaces.
Yeah, no, I can. And the other point I wanted to touch on when you talked about awareness, I think in the time we're living now, what we used to call as soft skills are really essential skills. Those are what I believe are going to help us navigate building future-ready organizations, communities, teams. Is moving away from thinking of those soft skills as secondary, but as vital skills. And the other thing you mentioned, I don't know if you heard about that warehouse fire in Ontario,
Hmm.
California.
Hmm.
And I was just reading in the New York Times how the arsonist had said, if you just paid us fairly, uh, for our work, maybe, he wouldn't have had to resort to this. And so, um, yeah, I think just the world is so different than it was before, and how people are expressing themselves around the polarization and the fatigue they're feeling and the exhaustion they're feeling.
The pressures
Yeah.
that, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So moving on from that, then, what I also hear a lot of or I feel like I'm hearing it a little bit less. I would hear a lot around about innovation in large organizations. We need to innovate, which usually meant to them optimization, not disruption, because no organization really wanted to disrupt. That was scary, and
Yes.
we generally they're risk averse, so they were really thinking about optimization. Now we're moving to this term transformation, right? We realize we need to be thinking about transformations. But when organizations say they want transformation, they often still want to operate with with habits built for sustainable stability. Sorry, I'm using all the wrong words, stability and control. What does inclusive change management require that traditional change management often misses?
I think this is such a great question. At its core, I was thinking about this question. I think traditional change management, from my experience, is about moving an organization from one state to another in a very structured, predictable way, setting direction, communicating clearly, celebrating the quick wins, and aligning people kind of around that. Models like Cotter is one that, I'm very familiar with, have been very useful. But they were built for more stable environments where change maybe was a bit more contained and predictable than it is now. And in my mind, what they don't fully account for is the level of complexity that we're navigating today that we touched on to some degree earlier. And when we're seeing changes continuous.
Mhm.
Trust is very fragile. People are positioned very differently within systems when we think through that equity or intersectional lens with different levels of access, safety, influence. And those experiences are shaped not just internally, but by a broader social, political, economic context. And so inclusive change starts, in my mind, from a different place. And perhaps it begins with the recognition that people don't experience change in the same way.
Mhm.
And that this isn't a peripheral idea. It's really central when we think about transformation or change. It really determines whether people trust the change,
Mhm.
whether they're participating in it or disengaged. And so we know when people have an opportunity to be part of the change to shape not just receive it, they're more likely to support it, or when there's psychological safety,
Mhm.
and that's not a soft term, when they're
Mhm.
able to be open, have candor, and whatnot, they're more likely to contribute and adapt, so to speak. So traditional models speak to, communication and buy-in, but in my mind, they don't go far enough in examining whether people actually feel safe, included, able to participate. And some of the questions I would offer those
Mhm.
listening is maybe asking ourselves who's experiencing this change and in what ways? How
Mhm.
is it maybe different? Who's shaping the change and who hasn't been a part of it? Where might trust already be fragile? What
Mhm.
does that look like? And what might be the unintended consequences that this might create, when we do take that more nuanced lens? So would be some questions that might help us dig a little deeper.
Can I ask, Golnaz, just in terms of psychological safety, what can we do to create that? Because that looks different so you may have a group or a team or community, and that is different for everyone, possibly, or a few of the people in that. What do we do to build that? And how do we know we have, to some level, gotten there?
Yeah. So I often draw from different people's works on psychological safety. There's the Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson that I appreciate, and I would say it often starts with the leadership
Hmm.
and how we show up, right? Are we vulnerable in how we show up? Are we transparent in how we show up? What's the type of culture that we create or climate that we create around setbacks, failure? I mean,
Hmm.
some aspects of failure, like safety is critical.
Mhm.
There's issues there, but if it's a failure around innovation or failure that promotes innovation, what is our appetite for that, and how do we navigate when people, may experience setbacks or whatnot? What is that climate like? How comfortable do we ensure people feel in speaking up and being open about things, sharing their perspectives, questioning things, bringing ideas forward? So I think those pieces are really important, and there are tools that can be implemented to assess psychological safety in
Oh,
organizations.
really?
But more than anything, it's like humanizing the relationship that we have with our teams. And
Mhm.
oftentimes, as leaders, we don't take into account the power dynamics. We think we're relatable and we think people will be open. But I would say to the audience, always assume that that's not the case, regardless of how open you are.
Mhm.
Um, Power dynamics are a thing for sure. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I would agree, but then I also think like, I generally, so when I think of myself, trying to create psychological safety in an organization, so I'm going to be really candid here. So I really work hard as a leader to build teams that are diverse in every way, generational diversity, because I benefit as a leader. So different ways of thinking, different genders, different ethnicities. Um, and then I think part of that, my responsibility then as leader is to then ensure I create psychological safety. If I'm bringing in so many different points of view, I create a space for them to share that point of view. Two things as a leader. One, I find it exhausting. So I found in one role that I was spending so much time ensuring that every single person who had very different needs as a professional was getting what they needed, but then I wasn't getting the time I needed to do actually do my work, right? And so and that's sometimes difficult too, is that maybe we also as leaders aren't in getting the space to lead in the way that's necessary to create the safety that we need to, because we have performance reviews, we have, milestones we need to hit, right? And that kind of leads into the next question. So in times of uncertainty, but I think even generally, there's often a push to move fast, to be efficient, have risk controls. And I've been really trying to integrate this thinking, not just with me, but my colleagues in different places. You need to go slow to go fast. You really need to go slow to go fast, right? And I've been forcing myself to get comfortable with going slow. And I know that there are trade-offs I have to make to go slow, but that will help me move faster in a way that's actually effective, as opposed to being a bull in a china shop. And so, how can leaders make room for equity, dignity, and lived experience without being seen as slowing down the whole organization?
I think that's a really interesting question. What comes to mind is why would it be seen as slowing down the organization? I mean,
Mhm.
on one hand, if we look at our entire workforce, right, regardless of our lived experience, we all bring something to the organization. We all bring complexities, and different experiences to organizations. But this question is interesting. I think it is a big tension that we navigate. There are real pressures to move quickly, to pivot, to respond, to be decisive. And that pressure, is real as we've talked about. But I want to reframe it a little bit. Maybe it's not about choosing between speed versus inclusion, but it's really about how we move as leaders. Because what I've seen in research and practice is that whether leaders move quickly, when leaders move quickly without understanding the impact or the context, that can create
Mhm.
rework, resistance, unintended harm. And I think about, a very real example that I watched kind of unfold was after the murder of George Floyd, many organizations, including academic institutions, moved very quickly to issue public statements of anti-Black racism as an example. And
Mhm.
the intent was important. But in some cases, the internal work hadn't been done.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, with one particular institution when they kind of came out with their messaging, alumni and community members responded with backlash and pointing to the gaps between kind of the public statement and their lived experience. So, what was meant to be a signal of leadership around being responsive ended up actually exposing a misalignment and maybe requiring a lot of repair. So that's the point here is like when we move quickly without understanding our own systems and practices, we can create unintended harm or outcomes. So the goal maybe is to create right, important pauses so that we can
Mm-hmm.
move with clarity and intention. So
Mm-hmm.
that would be my perspective on that.
Can I just how and you may not have the answer, and I don't have the answers. How do we, when you, because I come from a corporate background, how do I create those moments of pauses? And I ask because I don't actually, I try, my work requires that I influence. So I build relationships, build trust. And I actually intentionally came up with a definition of what is trust. We use that word. What does trust mean in this context? And so that's what I work to do. And I try to lean into my influence because so over time I create this, level of influence to create those pauses. But are there other ways to get leaders who don't pause to, how do I convince them? If are there other things I can be doing? And there may, I
I mean,
don't have an answer for that.
I think it's really individual, but I think about people in my community that lawyers, a variety of roles, and I think it really, from what I've experienced in the work that I'm currently doing myself, it starts with our own self-awareness around moments where I'm going to give a very practical answer here. Moments where we're contracting,
Mhm.
moments where we're agitated, moments
Yeah.
when we're in fear, moments where we ourselves are in discomfort. What are the cues where we can recognize that? Like, is that
Mhm.
something you do? I'm curious. Like, are you able to
Yeah.
recognize those moments?
It's taken me a very long time to get there. So I was not doing that in my 20s or 30s. I was
Neither
just
was I.
reacting.
Yeah,
And I have learned, like, if I'm feeling uh, uncomfortable with something, in my head right away, and it's taken me time to get to that place where right away I say, what is making me comfortable? Why am I feeling
yeah,
uncomfortable? Right? Or if I'm feeling, threatened or jealous, okay, what in me is causing that? And those were not automatic thoughts that used to come into my head. So
right.
I'm now there, but it has taken years to get
And
there.
just imagine it's a daily practice. It's not something like,
Mhm.
okay, I'm there and now, I
Mhm.
do it all the time.
Yeah.
But just think about this conversation where we're talking about change. It's
Hmm.
all around us. And so it really maybe the biggest part of an inclusive change management approach
Hmm.
is just as much about how we navigate our own experience with the change as leaders first and foremost before we can do anything out there with our teams or the organization or the world. I think this is one of the most important parts of the conversation. So recognizing for me, it's a feeling in my body that I'm starting to recognize the thoughts that come up. And I know, and I don't know if the audience relates to this, but when I jump and make decisions out of reaction to what I'm experiencing in that moment, and if that experience is fear and or whatever, it does not. It's not the optimal response. So maybe pausing, whether it's the experience I'm having or whether it's I just don't know the answer yet. I'm not really sure how to move forward on this. It really is as simple, and I say that, as stepping away and just taking time
It's,
to
and it's,
come at it from clarity. I have a colleague that we both know, Jennifer, who talks about a snow globe. What
mhm.
happens when you shake a snow globe?
Mhm. Oh,
It's
there's disruption. Yeah, it's
there's
all over.
disruption.
Yeah,
That's our state of thoughts and our inner state when we're navigating so much. But what happens when you just let it sit?
everything just settles, right?
Everything starts to settle. And that's what the
Yeah.
pause is. It doesn't have to be something intricate and complicated. It could literally be, I'm just going to step away for 30 minutes an hour, the afternoon, or until tomorrow, depending
Yeah.
on what it is.
And I agree with you. And what I want to also say to the audience is that the where I got to my asking myself questions and pauses was when started to realize also later in my life is that I am by reacting in this way and not pausing, I'm not getting the where I want to get to with whoever it is or in the situation. And it was happening over and over where I had to like really just like pull myself out. And then I had to, you know, I did a lot of reading, self-reflection, and started to think and then got comfortable with those questions. And even now, like those pauses, it's there are times when I know intellectually I need to step out of this and I need to pause, but I'm like, I'm not gonna pause. I'm not ready to pause. But I
Yeah.
know I need to, but I'm not going to. And
Well,
so
I don't know if you find this, but I find that when I do and I take perspective, I actually make much better decisions
oh
when
yes,
I come
no.
from clarity as opposed to
Always,
yeah,
always.
yeah,
And it's a far more constructive conversation
yeah.
or experience. And I know that intellectually. And I say this to the audience too, is that there's sometimes like don't beat yourself up
Oh
if
yeah.
at one time you didn't take that pause and you know
Oh,
you
I
should
still don't. Are you
have.
kidding me? I do
I
it less so than I used to, but I
still-
think
but
that's where the
yeah.
awareness comes in.
I know. Um, we had a question from the audience that goes back to the organizational psychology safety being
Mm.
sort of in given to the leader as their responsibility. Can leaders be expected to possess what can extend into clinical skills when they're given the responsibility of creating psychological safety? What
I'm not clear on what we mean by clinical skills.
So I saw maybe I'm actually just reading. Maybe what I'm learning is that I don't know what okay, so the audience member is maybe feeling that they don't know what psychological safety is. And I what I'd like to add is that so when I have diverse teams and I'm trying to create psychological safety, I
Hmm.
sometimes, and I don't know if this is where the audience member is going, is sometimes I feel like I also need to take on the role of therapist. I'm not trained to do that. And most of we're not trained to, um, as managers, we're not often sometimes trained to deal with the issues that our team is experiencing but also in a professional setting. I hope I have captured that correctly, from the person who's offered this question.
100%. So
Does that make sense?
totally, that part makes sense. I don't think workplaces are therapeutic spaces. Like there's
No.
professionals that offer, those things. But as leaders, if we step back and say, what is psychological safety? There's different definitions. The one that I often work with is Amy Edmondson's. She has a number of books out on the topic. Not perfect, but a good solid kind of body of work. And it's in her definition, it's a shared belief held by team members that the team is safe to take interpersonal risks,
Mhm.
essentially. So what does that mean?
Mhm.
So it's a climate where one can speak up with their ideas and not feel afraid that there will be repercussions or backlash. They can ask questions, they can share concerns, and they can make mistakes, not intentional, but we make mistakes, especially when we take risks and we want to innovate. Those things happen with experimentation,
Mhm.
etc. That there's no fear of punishment or humiliation or, being excluded or marginalized. So I think that's like at the core definition. And so when you think about that, I'd invite those listening to think about, well, then what, because inherently leaders have power within formal power within systems. How do we then need to show up as leaders to foster a climate that allows for
Mhm.
interpersonal risk taking?
Mhm. Great.
Um,
And
yeah.
two examples I want to give just in a corporate setting. So, in one example, I had a team member, a woman who was younger, in her late 20s and South Asian, and brilliant, and one-on-one and in conversations, brilliant, but in meetings wouldn't speak up. Um, and and I say that because I am a South Asian woman and was once a 20-year-old South Asian woman in the corporate world, I thought, I'm not going to. I can go in a meeting and say, I'm just making up a name. This wasn't her name, Sue. What do you think? But I thought I'm not going to do that because it may have the wrong impact. My intention is to bring her into the conversation. However, she may feel like she's being called out. So what I did was prior to the meeting, I said, Sue, you have great ideas, and I really would love for you to bring them forward because I feel sometimes your ideas then um, aren't yours, they become someone else's, right? And I really want you to be acknowledged. And so I had asked them if I could call them out in the meeting and ask them to, if I could say, Sue, what do you think? Would you be comfortable with that? And Sue said, yes, I'd be fine with that. And so we did that in the meeting, and it opened up space for her. But I knew that to do that because I was South Asian and once was like kind of saw myself in her. And another example, this gentleman I was working with, he's an older male, white, lovely, was in the military, now in a corporate environment. And he has a colleague who's quite junior, um, first generation Canadian of an Asian background, of Southeast Asia background. And he had said to me, she's brilliant, but she needs to be more assertive. And again, I don't share her identity, but thinking about my own identity, I'm like, well, she is young and she also comes from a culture where she may not have been given space to speak because she's a woman. And I said, because I'm now much more vocal. I said, it took me years to get to that place because I grew up where it was better to be seen than to be heard. Don't ask too many
Mhm.
questions. So, she would benefit from some support to get there, but maybe it's not just that she's not assertive, it's just
I
that she's
mean,
never.
workplaces are inherently designed for extroversion, right? There's a
Yeah.
book about that, The Power of Quiet. I can't remember the name, Susan Cain's book.
Okay.
That's number one. But also, maybe this is also about one-on-one interactions, like really thinking about interpersonal relationships. They don't just happen in meetings, in
Mhm.
those kinds of spheres, but one-on-one interactions. There's different spaces where
Mhm.
the conditions that we intentionally create says a lot, can say a lot. Do we cut people off when they do have the courage to speak? What happens after they use their words or share something? I
Mhm.
think that's equally important as what you said, like guiding those that maybe have lower social location or
Mhm.
may come from, cultures where humility is really promoted or whatever the case may be, is also like, what are we doing after we've heard someone share something or question
Mhm.
something? That's equally important.
This is just because what I'm thinking is like for this gentleman who had this young colleague who was he acknowledged super smart, lovely, and felt need to be more assertive. Would he benefit then from like because there's a lot of people like I'm going to call him Sam, right? Who are really good people, recognize great skill, but then don't see maybe why the person is showing up this way. Um, so what do we, and I ask as someone, if I'm in an organization, what do I do? Because I can't have all those individual conversations with everyone, right? Do I bring in someone like yourself to have a larger conversation? Is like, I'm wondering how I can make that change without me being the person who's having, whenever I see them, those moments.
I don't think there is one way, right? It really depends on the context and the organization or the team and what it really needs.
Mhm.
So for sure, I think what makes up a corporate culture or climate, there's a number of different things to consider. Certainly think, training and development would be one in terms of what are the behaviors that we all need to instill to create this environment where everyone feels, comfortable speaking up. I would also imagine from a systems level, there's things that need to happen. Like, how do we actually foster an organizational culture that fosters psychological safety and belonging? How is this
Mhm.
embedded in performance, like performance manager evaluations, right?
Yeah.
Our relationships with our managers dictate so much in terms of our experience within workplaces. And
Mhm.
many mean well, but they have also pressures coming from the top and the bottom, which is, I think, what you're also speaking to. So that's one piece. And then, many may not understand. I think what you're speaking to in the example that you gave of the younger colleague that you worked with, or when we talk about any minoritized groups, there's also history to take into account, the historical experiences of particular groups, current experiences, and a lot that's packed into that that impacts how we create psychological safety.
Hmm.
And that comes with, for sure, I think it's maybe training, but also a will to educate ourselves as well. I
Yeah.
really do. Like, I think as people leaders, we really, regardless of how busy we are,
Hmm.
um, it's incumbent on us to also have the will
Hmm.
to want to kind of learn in terms of how we can show up to foster
Hmm.
a climate where people can be open.
No, I agree with you. Okay, one thing, just one thought as you were speaking that came to, and I don't expect a response or anything unless you have one, is it is exhausting being in a leadership role at this s- place, like where we are in the world, because um, I have the will, but sometimes, because I'm also, a person of color, I've experienced racism in the workforce. I have two children who are people of color. I want to ensure that they are able to move to this world as human beings, comfortable with themselves, and are able to navigate the world around them in a way that feels good to them. So I agree it needs will, but I have to acknowledge that sometimes it gets very
It's
exhausting.
heavy,
Because,
100%.
yeah.
I lead a very small team of 3 to 5 from, depending on where the organization's at. And there's been times, Shilpa, where I'll say we have the kind of relationship where I'll say to the team,
Mhm.
this is what I'm going through, like a lot
Mhm.
happening right now. I'm taking the afternoon off and I will re-engage. And when I say off, I just need
Yeah.
to disengage, for a bit. And they're so respectful of that. I think
Mhm.
that in itself, in my world, I don't know if
Yeah.
that would be relevant in every organization. That in itself has fostered trust and
Mhm.
greater trust and more safety for others
Mhm.
as well.
The one thing I have to say is that you and I are both fortunate that we are able to sort of set some terms, right, in terms of how we choose to work. And I take that as a great privilege that we have, right? That we are now in a place where we can have conversations about what we need to as leaders within institutions that um, we work with, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, because I also remember a time when I couldn't have those conversations or create that
For
space for
sure,
myself.
for sure.
Um, we have another great question from the audience. How can leaders become more aware without tokenizing or making assumptions? What are good ways to learn about the others we work with? And you've touched on some of
Oh
this.
my gosh, there's so many things you can do. And if the audience has ideas, put them in the chat.
Yeah.
I really take the tokenizing to heart because your first go-to place can sometimes be problematic if you go directly to the one person in your organization that make maybe from a certain community. We actually did research that was funded by the Future Skills Center to better understand the experiences of Indigenous, Black, and racialized women in workplaces. And one of the themes that particularly came out for Indigenous women is I'm always held as the spokesperson for our community, yet Indigenous communities are so diverse and in a few cases, they were just reconnecting back to their communities, and there was a lot that was imposed that was very tokenizing. So I'm going to start with maybe a very not super exciting response, and that is there's so much information out there that it really does start with just doing your own research to find resources to read, books to read, tons of events that you can go to, courses that you can take, like just really starting with self-educating yourself. And particularly when it comes to the historical piece. I was giving a talk to a room full of DEI professionals who do incredible work, talk about like challenging work. And I remember asking questions about this country's history when it comes to not only Indigenous communities, but also racialized immigrants, and particularly those that are come from previously colonized countries, and how those histories carry forward here. And many hadn't heard of some of those historical pieces right here
Mhm.
in this country. When we do sustainability work, when we do DEI work, it's
Mhm.
always grounded in history. How did we get here? It didn't, the issues that we see or try to solve for didn't just happen overnight. So
Mhm.
I always suggest that we have an understanding of the history as much as what's happening in the now. And there's
Mhm.
so many resources and books that you can find depending on what it is that you're wanting to learn about. And also, there have been instances in my case, I'm curious what you think, but there are individuals that I have great relationships with, and I do ask questions, but I do it with permission.
Mhm. Mhm.
And as trust is built, I think people are more and more comfortable, but it's really about asking for permission. And then I've worked really, I've had a lot of curiosity, and it's really important for me, for my network and my community to be as diverse as possible. And
Mhm.
looking at where I can improve on that. But those genuine relationships with people also go a long way in terms of the communities that we spend time with. And then it becomes more transformational as opposed to transactional
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
No, thank you, Golnaz. Yeah. And another question I have, which you've touched on a bit earlier in our conversation when we talked about soft skills, because
Mm,
compassion is another word we hear a lot about, and a lot of what you're talking about just now kind of stems from compassion, curiosity, and also compassion. But in practice, it can be quite demanding to be compassionate. What does compassionate leadership, in your point of view and in your experience, actually look like when you yourself are dealing with conflict, competing needs, and real organizational pressures? Um, uh, yeah.
yeah.
As-
No, it's yes.
yeah.
And I love your distinction around how, what's often referred to as soft skills is really not soft at all. And it's what this world demands of us, and is so important. Compassion, to me is often misunderstood as soft. For me, compassion is the capacity to be present
Mhm.
and I'll use, a term that I learned from Thich Nhat Hanh's books and
Mhm.
work is to be present with maybe the hurts of your own, like the things that you're going through and what others are going through, and doing it with care, doing it with, a commitment to wanting to behave in ways that doesn't impose harm on others or at least reduces
Mhm.
harms. Like, how do we show up with others and with ourselves? I think it's just as important to be self-compassionate as it is to be compassionate towards others, because if we're not compassionate with ourselves first and foremost,
Yeah.
we can't be compassionate with others. There's Kristen Neff. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr.
Yeah.
Neff. She's done some really interesting work drawing from Eastern philosophies. I have to acknowledge where the work comes from,
Mhm.
but has done some really meaningful work on self-compassion. And
Mhm.
the idea there is often, what happens when someone we care about is going through something, we're the first to say, how can I help? I'm here to support you. And that's important, but how often do we do it for ourselves? And I think
Yeah.
this goes back to your point about, as leaders, how do we pause?
Mhm. Mhm.
Maybe compassionate leadership starts with being self-compassionate with ourselves, first and
Yeah.
foremost, to build that capacity for ourselves. Because I know when I'm moving forward in ways where I give that to myself, even if it's little pockets, then I can give more to others. I'm not doing it from an empty cup. And it
Mhm.
does not have to be intricate. It does not have to be expensive. It does not have to be
Yeah.
time consuming, right? So self-compassion for the self first and foremost, and then compassion for others. Are you familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh's work, or have you heard of
Yeah.
Thich Nhat Hanh?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I love what he often talked to, and that is that compassion isn't just a feeling; it's a way of being with what is difficult without turning away. It's about deep listening,
Yeah.
not to fix or respond immediately, but just try to understand.
Mhm.
And like that applies to the workplace as well with our team
Yeah.
members or our colleagues. Just try to understand.
Yeah.
And so importantly, again, it doesn't mean losing discernment. Compassion also includes clarity. So the ability to see what is needed and to act with intention, even when that involves making hard decisions sometimes, right? Like that's part of compassion. And so it's not just about warmth and showing care, but it's presence, understanding, and then taking wise action, which I feel like we've already talked about to some degree.
Yeah.
So that's how I would define it. I think it's important to talk about self-compassion as much as showing up with compassion for others. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
The self-compassion piece it resonates so deeply with me because I didn't have a lot of it and I didn't think I
Yeah, me
re needed
neither.
it, right? Like prior to working corporate, I worked in the world of international development and I always felt I had no reason to complain because of what I was seeing in the world every day. And I learned, I was in India working with a Canadian think tank and I was doing a lot of work in Bangladesh. And that's when I had to stop and say, Shilpa, you're allowed to have a miserable day or to feel sad. Because I always said, why would I be sad? I have no reason to be sad when I see what I'm seeing every single day and meeting some people who've gone through horrific, horrific
Mm,
experiences. I can't even imagine any of that and what I see currently happening in the world. And it took me a while to realize that it was okay for me to be sad or to just need to step away from what I was seeing. Because I also thought they can't step away. Why should I feel like I should step
mm,
away, right?
mm,
And I also the thing I often remind myself is what you say to yourself is you need to be really careful with what you say to yourself because it has huge impacts on you. And with my children too, my 13-year-old will say, "Oh, I was just so dumb for doing that." I'm like, you're not dumb. You shouldn't, and I stop my kids now and I have told them what you say to yourself is really, really
mm.
important. You have to have good hygiene around the words that you're using to describe yourself. And
Language is so powerful. It really is.
so
To your
powerful.
point about your experience when you were in international development, I do social impact work as well, and
Mhm.
probably many listening, have a role to play. I feel like, there was an element of that for me, and then I burnt out, and then
Yeah.
I can't do what I want to do. I can't have the impact or do the convening and the work that we do. So. I see it now very differently.
I
Where,
do
if I,
too.
yeah,
Yeah. I think
exactly.
sometimes for me, I think it's like the benefits of getting older and being older because I see and I mean I think it's not just like you age and you gain all this wisdom. It's also seeking out the wisdom, right? It's not like, oh my, yeah, I'm 40 now.
I actually hit rock bottom. I remember I'm not going to bore the audience with it, but I was like in the throes of my dissertation, lots going on in my life. And I literally froze for a year with a lot of self-doubt when I
Yeah.
was in the all but dissertation. And then I found this body of work on self-compassion, and
Mhm.
it got me into spirituality and prayer and
Mhm.
just nourishing myself and really honoring the feelings and whatnot. And it shifted a lot. It really did.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I feel that too, and yeah, I also I think part of what supports my leadership is I've started meditating, which then gives
Yes.
me the time to think about like compassion in the way you've described it, where I can have discomfort and still be compassionate. And but I remember, when I was younger and going through this like move, move, move. I remember sitting down to meditate. So I was like, okay, this will help me. And it was like, meditation gives me migraines. I hate meditation. And I like refuse to do it because I was like, this is like, I hate this process.
Yes.
And I
You know what
think,
I would say? We actually had this conversation in one of our communities where someone said just that. And they said, for me, I find it's not meditation or breathing yet, but I shake it off. Like anything
yeah,
to settle yourself and just look after your needs. It
yeah.
can't be, it's so important.
Yeah, no, I learned for me at that point, movement was the way. It wasn't to
Mm,
sit still. And now I can do both, but it's taken me time.
nice.
We are in the last few minutes of our
That went by quickly. Oh my
conversation. That just
gosh.
kind of flew by. I hope it flew by for the audience too. I hope you're not like, I've had to sit through this. But I want to ask you one last question. You have done important work on diversity narratives and the business and moral case for inclusion. In today's environment where DEI language is being contested and watered down, how should leaders talk about equity in ways that are both courageous and credible? I think this is a good way to end the conversation, a
Yeah,
good
yeah, yeah,
session.
for sure. So thank you. So we are in a moment of time when equity language is being challenged and softened in some cases, and south of the border politicized in so many different ways. And I think the response is not to retreat from the language, but to become maybe more precise and grounded and honest in how we're using it. This is something that I've studied with one of my research colleagues, Dr. Kelly Dye. We actually have done a longitudinal study where we looked at how organizations speak to DE&I. We went in, collected data in 2013 and then again in 2023. And so what we found is that across organizations, the business case dominates where equity is framed as a driver for innovation, for talent, and for performance. And while that's not wrong, what gets lost is that people themselves start to be positioned as assets to be leveraged, rather than individuals experiencing systems differently or individuals that um, um, like we should all be afforded the same opportunities in a system, so to speak. But at the same time, many organizations are also now, what we found is kind of a shift over this time frame, are using more moral or justice-based language, especially in the 2023 data, but without the structural accountability to back it up in many, many cases. So you end up with what I call justice language without justice action in meaningful ways. And so it's a form of impression management, like where we may
Yeah.
be giving the impression that we're doing things, but are we really at that systems level that you were speaking to? We also saw that organizations tend to tell a very linear progress narrative. So, just celebrating the organization as the hero of their work,
Yeah.
which again, doing this work as one of my colleagues that's in sustainability and D&I says, and I agree, you have to celebrate every little win. But, again, we have to think about, are we minimizing the tensions and, the things that aren't always spoken about? So importantly, we also looked at how organizations are talking about different groups of people, even when it comes to their initiatives around women and intersectional experiences tend to be invisible in how that work is described. And that, again, language is very powerful. So,
Yeah.
what are the experiences of, Indigenous women, Black women, racialized women, those that are part of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, or et cetera, right? So,
Mhm.
not talked about in those nuanced ways. And we also looked at sustainability reports. So I'm going to come to a topic that's very near and dear to your heart. And what we found was that many organizations report outputs,
Yeah.
number of training delivered, participation in programs, percentage of women in leadership. And so that's what's visible. But I'm curious, what's the problem with that?
Mhm.
What do
Oh,
you think is the problem with that?
I have many problems with
Yeah,
sustainability report, many problems with reporting.
right?
But it's not focused on impact or outcome. It's just
That's
outputs,
it.
and it's not meaningful, right?
It's not
In any
meaningful.
way. Yeah. No.
So then that would be my call to leaders is language is very powerful, but also the story that you're telling about the impact that you're having is very powerful too.
Mhm.
How can we hold ourselves accountable to report more than just outputs, to
Mhm.
talk about outcomes, and to start delve into systems change a level work, which goes back to where we started. But also, in addition to that, uh, I think it's equally important to then look internally and say how do we address quote unquote the rules to create systems change. what are the incentives and accountabilities that we have aligned? How is decision-making power? Is it distributed or is it concentrated? But also, are we doing this work in a way that's integrated into like the core business practices and strategies as opposed to like off to the side?
Mhm.
And, again, strictly for impact measurement. So that's kind of where the research took us and where we're at.
Oh, fantastic. I'm would love to see more of this research. Golnaz, it's fantastic work that you have been doing throughout your career. And I want to thank you for sharing your time and your expertise and insights with us. It's been, as always, so wonderful to see you, to talk to you, to learn from you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Shilpa. And thank you, Roxanne, and everyone that's here with us. Thank you.
Yay. Thank you so much. And just to repeat what I put in the chat in case folks haven't seen it, we have other talks in the Hope and Action series coming up. Those are all on our website. I will be sending everyone who is here today an email after this that will have a link to the recording, that will have information about our course and programs and about upcoming sessions right there. So I'll just join Shilpa in thanking you again, Golnaz, and I will also thank Shilpa. Thanks everyone for your time, for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.